Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. I'm Adam, and today, Julia and I are here to explore one of the most complex and significant geopolitical issues of our time, the China-India border conflicts and the diplomatic efforts that have shaped their history. This is not just a regional matter. It affects global politics, trade, and security in ways that many people might not realize, and that's exactly why we want to discuss it with you in detail.
Yes. And before we dive in, dear listeners, if you enjoy learning about international affairs and how they shape our world, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future episodes. We'd also love to know where you're listening from, so please share your location in the comments and tell us your opinions about today's topic. Your engagement helps us bring you more thoughtful and deeply researched discussions.
Now, the China-India border issue might sound like just another dispute over land, but it is far more than that. This is a matter that has historical roots stretching back over a century, shaped by colonial-era boundary definitions, wartime experiences, and ongoing military standoffs. It involves the world's two most populous nations, both of which are nuclear powers, with rapidly growing economies and global influence. Their ability to manage this dispute peacefully has huge implications for stability, not only in Asia, but across the world.
Exactly. The border itself is not a simple line on a map. It runs through some of the highest and harshest terrain on Earth, covering roughly 3,488 kilometers, and is divided into three main sectors: the western sector in Ladakh, the middle sector in Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, and the eastern sector in Arunachal Pradesh. Each of these areas has its own set of disputes, historical claims, and strategic concerns, making the situation incredibly complex.
And what makes this even more important for the world is that both countries are now global economic engines. India and China are part of key international organizations, like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they share trade relations worth billions of dollars every year. A serious conflict between them could disrupt global supply chains, shift alliances, and affect markets from Asia to Europe and the Americas.
That's right. And it's also worth noting that this isn't just a dispute about who controls which valley or which mountain pass. It's a test of diplomacy, leadership, and the ability of two rising powers to resolve differences without resorting to large-scale war. Every time there's an escalation along the border, whether it's a standoff or a deadly clash, it raises questions about how much progress has really been made in building trust between these nations.
For today's episode, our goal is to break down the history, the key moments of tension, and the diplomatic initiatives that have tried to address this long-running problem. We'll explore how the past has shaped the present, what strategies have worked, what has failed, and what the future might look like if both sides continue on their current path. We want this to be clear and accessible, but also factually accurate, so you can leave with a deeper understanding of why this matters so much.
And we also hope that by the end, you'll see how this issue connects to everyday life, even for people living far away from the Himalayas. The peace, stability, and cooperation between China and India can affect global energy prices, the safety of sea trade routes, the strength of regional alliances, and even the pace of technological collaboration. This is not just a story for diplomats and military analysts. It's a story for all of us.
To understand why the China-India border dispute is so important, we need to look at the sheer scale of the countries involved. Together, China and India are home to over 2.8 billion people, making up more than a third of the world's population. Both are major players in global trade, manufacturing, and technology, and both are investing heavily in infrastructure, defense, and foreign diplomacy. A conflict between them would not just be local, it would ripple across every continent.
The disputed border, known in official terms as the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, is not formally demarcated on the ground, which means that in many areas there is no physical fence or clear division that both sides agree upon. This lack of a mutually accepted boundary has led to frequent patrol confrontations, where soldiers from each side claim the other has crossed into their territory. These encounters can range from tense standoffs to violent clashes.
What makes this situation so unique is that both nations claim historical legitimacy over different parts of the border. In the western sector, for example, the dispute centers on Aksai Chin, a high-altitude desert that is administered by China but claimed by India. It's strategically important because it connects China's Xinjiang and Tibet regions. India, however, considers it part of its Union territory of Ladakh, which makes it a deeply emotional and political issue.
The eastern sector is another flashpoint. Here, the McMahon Line, drawn during the British colonial period in 1914, is at the heart of the disagreement. India accepts this line as the boundary, but China does not recognize it, instead claiming large parts of Arunachal Pradesh as its own territory, calling it South Tibet. This disagreement has led to repeated diplomatic protests and occasional troop build-ups in the area.
In the middle sector, covering parts of Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, the disputes are less intense, but still unresolved. The terrain here is mountainous and less strategically critical than in the other sectors, which has allowed for relatively peaceful coexistence, but the underlying claims remain. The fact that no part of the border is fully settled means the potential for tension is always present.
It's also important to understand the role of history in keeping this dispute alive. The borders we see today are largely the result of colonial-era negotiations and agreements that neither China nor India was fully satisfied with. After independence in 1947 and the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, both nations had urgent domestic priorities, but the border disagreements soon resurfaced, leading to the War of 1962. That conflict deeply shaped perceptions and distrust on both sides.
Beyond the historical disputes, there's also the matter of geography and environment. The LAC runs through some of the harshest landscapes on Earth, with freezing temperatures, thin air, and dangerous terrain. Soldiers stationed here endure extreme conditions year-round. Building and maintaining roads, airstrips, and supply lines in such places is difficult and costly, yet both sides have invested heavily in infrastructure to strengthen their positions.
And these investments are not only military. Both China and India have improved civilian infrastructure close to the border, such as highways and railways, which can also serve a strategic role during times of tension. For example, China has expanded its road network in Tibet, while India has accelerated construction of roads and bridges in border states. While officially these projects support local development, they also improve military mobility.
The international community watches this situation carefully because the stakes are high. Both countries are nuclear powers, and while neither side has signaled an intention to escalate to that level, even a conventional conflict could destabilize Asia. Nations like the United States, Russia, and Japan, as well as organizations like the United Nations, have a vested interest in ensuring that tensions do not spiral out of control.
Diplomatic engagement has been ongoing for decades, but progress is slow. Multiple rounds of talks have taken place at both the military and political levels. Confidence-building agreements have been signed, but violations and accusations still occur. The challenge is that neither side wants to be seen as compromising too much, as public opinion in both countries is often sensitive to perceived weakness in national security matters.
One reason this issue is so difficult to resolve is the broader strategic competition between China and India. Both nations want to be the dominant power in Asia, and their interests sometimes clash in areas like trade routes, influence over neighboring countries, and participation in international alliances. The border dispute, while rooted in history, is also a symbol of this larger rivalry.
At the same time, Both countries have strong reasons to avoid open conflict. Their economies are deeply tied to global markets, and both are focused on domestic development goals. War would disrupt trade, investment, and political stability, potentially undoing years of economic progress. This mutual need for stability is one of the main reasons why, despite recurring tensions, both sides have returned to the negotiating table time and again.
For our listeners, understanding this background is essential before we go deeper into the history and key events in later parts of this podcast. The China-India border dispute is not just a problem between two nations. It is a test case for whether major powers can resolve deep-seated disagreements without war. It's a story of geography, history, politics, and diplomacy, all colliding in one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth.
And as we move forward, keep in mind that every skirmish, every negotiation, and every agreement is shaped by decades of history and the strategic calculations of two rising powers. This is why your awareness and understanding matter, because global stability depends on the ability of nations like China and India to manage such disputes peacefully.
Dear listeners, now that we've introduced the importance of the China-India border issue, it's crucial to understand its historical roots, which go back more than a century. The disputes we see today cannot be fully explained without looking at the colonial period, when British India and the Qing dynasty in China tried to define territorial boundaries in remote and rugged regions. Many of the borders drawn at that time were based on limited geographic knowledge and political convenience, rather than clear agreements with local populations.
That's right, Adam. One of the key outcomes of this period was the Himalayan line, established in 1914 during the Simla Convention, which was meant to define the boundary between British India and Tibet. While India recognizes this line as the legal boundary, China has never accepted it, arguing that Tibet had no authority to sign such an agreement independently, and therefore the line is invalid. This early disagreement laid the groundwork for disputes that would persist long after independence.
It's also important to note that the British approach to mapping and administration often ignored the local realities of ethnic and cultural boundaries. The colonial powers prioritized strategic advantage, trade routes, and political control over clear geographic continuity. This meant that when India became independent in 1947, the borders inherited from the British were not fully settled, leaving many areas, especially in the Himalayas, ambiguous.
Exactly. And in addition to the Himalayan line, the western sector of the border also became a point of contention due to Aksai Chin, a high-altitude desert region. British maps of the time were inconsistent, with some showing it as part of Ladakh, under India, and others showing it as part of Xinjiang under China. When the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, they claimed Aksai Chin as part of Tibet, and India inherited its claim from the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, creating a territorial overlap.
After India gained independence, both nations initially tried to maintain friendly relations, but the lack of clarity over borders became a source of tension. China's early maps started to show broader claims in the eastern and western sectors, reflecting their perspective that certain regions had historically been under Chinese suzerainty. India, on the other hand, insisted that its boundaries reflected historical treaties and administrative control inherited from the British.
The early diplomatic exchanges in the 1950s were aimed at resolving these differences, but miscommunication and differing interpretations of history often made progress difficult. China proposed recognizing certain boundaries, while India hoped for a joint approach to defining the LAC. Unfortunately, both sides viewed these discussions through the lens of national pride and security concerns, which complicated negotiations and set the stage for future confrontations.
Another significant historical factor was Tibet's political status. Before 1950, Tibet was largely autonomous, and its relations with both China and India were unique. The Chinese government's entry into Tibet in 1950 heightened India's concerns about its northern borders and strategic depth. India feared that Chinese control over Tibet could allow them to project military power directly toward Indian territories, especially along the border regions that were already ambiguous.
And this fear became particularly important in the western sector, where Aksai Chin connects Tibet with Xinjiang. For China, controlling this corridor allowed strategic movement and infrastructure development, including roads that became critical later during conflicts. For India, the loss or control of even small areas along this corridor had both symbolic and strategic implications, since it touched on national sovereignty and territorial integrity.
As we examine history, it's also clear that the early post-independence period was marked by optimism in India-China relations. There were exchanges of letters between Prime Minister Nehru and Chairman Mao in the 1950s expressing friendship and cooperation. Yet underneath this diplomacy, the unresolved territorial claims and differing perceptions of history created latent tension. While leaders spoke of harmony, both countries were quietly preparing to assert their claims if necessary.
The strategic importance of certain areas cannot be overstated. For instance, the eastern sector, particularly Arunachal Pradesh, has fertile valleys, major river systems, and important trade routes. For China, this region represents a buffer zone, while for India, it is an integral part of its northeastern states. The ambiguity created during the colonial period allowed both nations to frame historical arguments that reinforced their modern territorial claims.
Another key point is that India and China's maps from this era were often inconsistent, sometimes deliberately so. Both sides tried to consolidate claims based on historical documents, surveys, and treaties. However, inconsistencies in mapping technology and knowledge of the high-altitude terrain meant that the physical realities on the ground did not always match the maps. This made border patrols, local administration, and later military operations increasingly complex and prone to misunderstandings.
Finally, the legacy of this historical period is still visible today. Even after decades of talks, the same areas that were ambiguous a century ago remain sources of tension. While the McMahon Line, Aksai Chin, and other disputed regions might seem distant or abstract, they carry enormous historical, strategic, and national significance for both countries. Understanding this history is essential to grasp why diplomacy and military standoffs continue to this day.
So, dear listeners, as we move forward in our discussion in later sections, remember that the roots of the China-India border conflict are not just about modern political disputes. They are embedded in a complex history of colonial administration, differing interpretations of treaties, and strategic calculations. These historical origins help explain why even seemingly small incidents along the border can escalate into major diplomatic or military crises.
And by understanding this history, we can appreciate the challenges faced by diplomats, military planners, and citizens on both sides. The dispute is not just about land, it is about identity, sovereignty, and national pride. It is a living history, influencing contemporary relations and shaping the way these two Asian giants interact with each other and the rest of the world.
Dear listeners, now we arrive at one of the most pivotal moments in China-India relations, the 1962 Sino-Indian War. This conflict marked the first major military confrontation between the two nations and left a lasting imprint on diplomacy, military strategy, and public perception in both countries. To understand why this war occurred, we need to examine the events leading up to it, including political decisions, border disputes, and the broader regional context in the early 1960s.
That's correct, Adam. By the late 1950s, tensions along the disputed borders, particularly in Aksai Chin in the west and the eastern sector in Arunachal Pradesh, had been steadily increasing. China had completed infrastructure projects, including the construction of a strategic road through Aksai Chin connecting Xinjiang and Tibet, which India saw as an encroachment on its territory. Diplomatic negotiations were ongoing, but the lack of agreement on the line of actual control created uncertainty and mistrust.
During this period, India initiated the Forward Policy, which involved establishing small military posts in disputed areas to assert sovereignty and deter Chinese advances. While India intended this as a defensive measure, China perceived these forward posts as provocative actions that threatened its strategic interests. Both nations interpreted each other's military movements with suspicion, escalating tensions to a point where minor incidents could trigger larger confrontations.
The immediate causes of the conflict also included broader geopolitical considerations. China was consolidating control over Tibet, establishing administrative authority and military presence in the region, while India faced internal political pressures to protect its northern borders. Moreover, the global context of the Cold War influenced both sides, as they were concerned about alliances, foreign influence, and international perception, which added pressure to assert territorial claims firmly.
By October 1962, tensions had escalated into open conflict. The Chinese People's Liberation Army launched offensives in both the eastern and western sectors. In the eastern sector, they advanced rapidly into disputed areas in Arunachal Pradesh, overwhelming Indian forces stationed there. The mountainous terrain, harsh climate, and logistical challenges made it extremely difficult for India to mount an effective defense, while Chinese forces benefited from superior preparation and mobility in these areas.
In the western sector, the fighting focused on Aksai Chin, where China sought to secure its road link between Xinjiang and Tibet. India, facing both logistical difficulties and underestimation of Chinese strength, was unable to prevent Chinese advances. The military engagements were intense, with soldiers enduring freezing temperatures, high altitudes, and limited supplies, which compounded the challenges of combat and contributed to heavy casualties on both sides.
The war lasted for about a month, from October 20th to November 21st, 1962, and ended with a unilateral Chinese ceasefire. China declared that it had achieved its objectives, particularly in securing Aksai Chin, and withdrew from some areas in the eastern sector. India, facing a sudden and unexpected military setback, was forced to reassess its border strategy, strengthen its armed forces, and reconsider its diplomatic approach toward China.
International reactions to the conflict were significant. Many countries, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, monitored the situation closely. While most foreign powers expressed concern over the outbreak of hostilities, there was limited direct intervention. The war demonstrated the strategic importance of the region and highlighted the risks of unresolved border disputes between emerging powers.
Domestically, the war had profound effects on India. It led to political criticism of the government for unpreparedness and misjudgment of Chinese intentions. India immediately undertook measures to modernize its military, strengthen border infrastructure, and improve intelligence gathering. The psychological impact of the war shaped public opinion for decades, fostering a cautious and vigilant approach toward China that continues to influence policy even today.
For China, the war was also significant, as it reinforced the importance of controlling strategic territory for national security. It sent a clear message to India about Chinese resolve and capability, while also boosting domestic confidence in the leadership's ability to project power along remote borders. However, China's withdrawal from parts of the eastern sector indicated a willingness to avoid prolonged occupation, reflecting a measured approach rather than total territorial ambition.
The 1962 war also highlighted the role of terrain and logistics in high-altitude warfare. Both sides had to contend with glaciers, snowfields, and rugged mountains, which affected troop movements, supply chains, and the conduct of operations. The lessons learned during this war shaped military doctrines in India and China, leading to changes in training, infrastructure development, and border management strategies in the decades that followed.
It's important for listeners to understand that the 1962 war was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of border tensions rooted in history. The unresolved disputes, differing interpretations of agreements, and strategic concerns meant that both nations remained vigilant, and smaller skirmishes and standoffs continued to occur in subsequent decades. The war served as a stark reminder of the potential consequences of unresolved disputes and the need for effective diplomacy.
After the war, diplomatic efforts resumed, focusing on ceasefire agreements and mechanisms to prevent future escalation. In 1963, India and China signed a memorandum on the establishment of the line of actual control, attempting to clarify positions and reduce the risk of accidental conflict. While this helped to stabilize the border temporarily, many underlying issues remained unresolved, setting the stage for future tensions and negotiations.
For our listeners, the key takeaway from the 1962 war is that history is not just a record of past events. It shapes present policies, strategic thinking, and public perception. The war created mistrust, influenced military and diplomatic strategies, and continues to inform how both nations handle border disputes. Understanding these events provides essential context for analyzing later conflicts, standoffs, and diplomatic negotiations between China and India.
In summary, the 1962 Sino-Indian War was a watershed moment that combined history, strategy, geography, and diplomacy. It was a brief but intense conflict whose consequences are still felt today. As we move forward in our podcast, we'll examine the post-war period, including military buildup, confidence-building measures, and diplomatic efforts to prevent further escalation, which remain critical to understanding the modern dynamics of the China-India border. Dear listeners, after the 1962 war, both China and India entered a period of reflection, military reorganization, and cautious diplomacy. The immediate aftermath of the conflict left India shocked, with a heightened awareness of its northern vulnerabilities. India realized that strengthening its armed forces and infrastructure along the disputed border was not optional, but an urgent necessity to prevent another sudden escalation in remote high-altitude regions where logistics and terrain posed serious challenges.
That's right, Adam. In the years following 1962, India launched a comprehensive military modernization program. This included increasing troop numbers, improving high-altitude training for soldiers, establishing more permanent outposts in strategic sectors, and enhancing communication systems across difficult terrain. Roads, airstrips, and bridges were constructed to support both civilian and military movement, reflecting a dual approach of defense preparedness and regional development, particularly in Ladakh, Himachal Pradesh, and Arunachal Pradesh.
On the Chinese side, the post-war period also involved significant military consolidation along the border. China maintained strong forces in Tibet and Xinjiang, ensuring strategic control of vital routes such as the Aksai-Chin corridor. These deployments were not just about defense. They were also a demonstration of China's determination to protect its territorial claims and strategic interests. The combination of infrastructure and military presence allowed China to project power into disputed areas, sending a clear signal to India and the international community.
Diplomatic relations during this period were cautious but persistent. India and China held talks aimed at stabilizing the situation, creating mechanisms to prevent accidental clashes, and exploring ways to build confidence between their armies. Agreements such as the 1963 and later 1970s protocols sought to regulate troop movements, establish communication channels, and manage patrolling practices. While these efforts did not resolve the underlying territorial disagreements, they helped avoid direct conflict for many years.
Despite diplomatic efforts, the post-war years were marked by periodic tension and mistrust. Both sides engaged in intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and strategic positioning in disputed regions. Skirmishes and confrontations were reported occasionally, emphasizing that the border was far from settled. For both countries, the focus was on maintaining readiness, preventing surprise incursions, and demonstrating resolve to domestic and international audiences without triggering full-scale war.
Another aspect of post-war relations was economic and political engagement outside the border issue. Both India and China explored trade, cultural exchanges, and multilateral diplomacy to manage the broader relationship. By fostering cooperation in areas like trade and international forums, both nations attempted to balance competition with collaboration, aiming to reduce the likelihood that border tensions would spiral into prolonged conflict. However, the shadow of 1962 always lingered, influencing public sentiment and government decisions.
The memory of 1962 also prompted India to rethink its strategic doctrine. Military planners emphasized the need for rapid mobilization, specialized mountain warfare units, and advanced logistics. Exercises simulating high-altitude warfare became routine, while India's defense policy increasingly prioritized border security, surveillance, and intelligence gathering. This period laid the foundation for a more structured and professional approach to managing remote frontier regions, particularly those near disputed sectors.
China similarly focused on consolidating logistical advantages and infrastructure development in Tibet and Xinjiang. Roads, airstrips, and communication networks were expanded to improve rapid troop movement. This dual approach of military readiness and territorial control ensured that China could respond quickly to any perceived threats along the line of actual control, while maintaining the appearance of restraint and measured engagement to avoid international criticism.
It's also worth noting that both nations became more cautious about international involvement in their bilateral disputes. While the Cold War context made outside powers interested in Asian geopolitics, India and China largely preferred to manage their border issues bilaterally. This period saw limited third-party intervention, and both countries emphasized sovereignty, self-reliance, and the importance of direct negotiation to prevent misunderstandings from escalating into new conflicts.
Confidence-building measures became a cornerstone of post-war diplomacy. India and China established formal communication channels between military commanders, agreements on troop patrols, and protocols for managing incidents along the LAC. These measures were designed to prevent misunderstandings, reduce the risk of accidental escalation, and provide a framework for dialogue. While they did not settle territorial claims, they created mechanisms that both sides could rely upon to manage tensions more predictably.
The post-war period also reinforced the strategic significance of border regions in broader foreign policy. India realized that its northern borders were vulnerable not only to China, but also to wider regional dynamics, including Pakistan and Central Asia. Similarly, China recognized that maintaining control over Tibet and Aksai Chin was essential for national security and internal stability. This strategic awareness drove both countries to invest heavily in infrastructure, military readiness, and diplomatic engagement over the next decades.
For our listeners, the lessons from this period are clear. Post-war relations between China and India were shaped by a combination of caution, preparation, and cautious diplomacy. Both countries understood the consequences of another conflict, yet they remained vigilant, constantly balancing deterrence with dialogue. Infrastructure, military modernization, and agreements on communication became central tools to manage the risk of renewed confrontation.
By analyzing the post-war years, we can see that history is never static. The memories of conflict, the lessons learned from mistakes, and the strategic realities of the region all influenced how India and China approached their borders. This period set the stage for later agreements, standoffs, and negotiations, and it illustrates the complex interplay between military readiness and diplomacy in international relations.
Ultimately, dear listeners, the post-1962 period shows how nations must continuously adapt to both historical legacies and evolving geopolitical realities. The China-India border remained a region of strategic competition, but it also became an arena for experimentation with confidence-building measures, diplomacy, and military modernization. Understanding this period helps explain why the border issue continues to attract attention today and why every diplomatic or military decision has long-term consequences.
Dear listeners, after decades of unresolved tensions and occasional border standoffs, India and China began a new phase of diplomacy in the early 1990s, focused on reducing the risk of accidental conflict along the line of actual control. Both nations recognized that high-altitude military confrontations were costly, logistically difficult, and dangerous for soldiers stationed in remote regions. The aim was to establish formal mechanisms that could prevent misunderstandings and build trust, even while the core territorial disputes remained unresolved.
That's correct, Adam. In 1993, the two countries signed the first major agreement known as the Agreement on the Maintenance of Peace and Tranquility along the line of actual control in the India-China border areas. This agreement formalized several key principles, including the avoidance of large-scale troop deployment in disputed areas, mutual restraint during patrolling, and consultation mechanisms to clarify any border incidents. It was a significant step because it established a framework for structured dialogue between military forces in the field.
The 1993 agreement also emphasized the importance of communication. Both nations agreed to improve information sharing, notify each other about military exercises near the border, and avoid activities that could escalate tensions. While it did not resolve the underlying claims over Aksai Chin or Arunachal Pradesh, it created confidence-building measures designed to reduce the risk of accidental skirmishes, which had been a constant threat in earlier decades.
Following the 1993 agreement, negotiations continued, culminating in the 1996 Agreement on Confidence-Building Measures in the Military Field along the line of actual control. This agreement expanded upon the earlier one by specifying concrete measures to prevent incidents, such as prohibiting the use of firearms within a certain distance of the border, limiting patrolling to defined routes, and encouraging joint observation of sensitive areas. It was a continuation of a deliberate strategy to reduce friction while maintaining sovereignty claims.
One of the remarkable aspects of the 1996 agreement was the creation of direct communication channels between military commanders on both sides. These channels allowed rapid clarification of incidents, minimizing the chances of misunderstandings turning into serious confrontations. Prior to this, many tense situations had escalated because of delayed or misinterpreted information. By providing structured lines of communication, both armies could respond more calmly and professionally to potential border violations.
Another critical feature of the confidence-building agreements was their emphasis on predictability. Both sides agreed to provide advance notice for major military exercises near the border, restrict movements in disputed areas, and avoid provocative maneuvers. These measures were designed not only to prevent clashes, but also to demonstrate goodwill and maintain a degree of trust, even in a context where historical grievances and strategic rivalry remained strong.
The 1993 and 1996 agreements also reflected the changing geopolitical environment. During the early 1990s, China and India were both opening their economies, seeking foreign investment, and looking to participate more actively in regional and global institutions. The costs of conflict had increased significantly, and both countries understood that repeated border clashes could undermine economic growth, disrupt trade, and damage international standing. Diplomacy became as important as military preparedness in managing their relationship.
It's important for listeners to note that these agreements did not create a permanent solution to the border dispute. Core issues, such as the sovereignty over Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh, remained unresolved. However, the confidence-building measures reduced the frequency and intensity of violent incidents. Both nations recognized that it was possible to manage tensions and maintain peace along the LAC without sacrificing their claims, providing a model for practical coexistence amid unresolved disputes.
The implementation of these agreements required continuous monitoring and engagement at multiple levels. Military patrols were trained to follow specific protocols, commanders met regularly to discuss sensitive issues, and diplomatic channels were used to coordinate responses to any violations. Over time, these structured practices became institutionalized, creating a more professional and disciplined approach to border management than in previous decades.
Another notable outcome was the gradual development of mutual understanding between local commanders. By establishing routine meetings and direct lines of communication, soldiers and officers could discuss problems, share observations, and coordinate actions. This kind of trust building was subtle but crucial because high-altitude border areas are inherently prone to accidents, and misjudgments can escalate quickly if there is no established mechanism for dialogue.
Economically and politically, the agreements also signaled a desire to stabilize bilateral relations. With growing trade ties, investment opportunities, and participation in multilateral organizations, both India and China had strong incentives to avoid the kind of violent confrontations that had occurred in the past. Confidence-building measures were a way to create a predictable environment that allowed economic and diplomatic engagement to proceed without the constant fear of sudden escalation.
Importantly, the 1993 and 1996 agreements laid the groundwork for subsequent negotiations. In later years, additional protocols and discussions would build upon these foundations, attempting to resolve misunderstandings more effectively and address recurring standoffs. While progress was incremental, the agreements represented a paradigm shift. Both countries recognized that formal diplomacy and military protocols could coexist with unresolved sovereignty claims.
For listeners, the key takeaway is that these agreements demonstrate how structured diplomacy can prevent conflict, even in highly contested and strategic regions. While they did not resolve the territorial dispute itself, the 1993 and 1996 measures showed that dialogue, restraint, and professional military conduct could significantly reduce the risk of escalation, providing a model for managing other complex border disputes around the world.
In summary, the post-1990 agreements were about pragmatism, not concession. They reflected a mutual understanding that while India and China would continue to assert their territorial claims, it was in both nations' interest to maintain peace, avoid unnecessary confrontation, and create reliable mechanisms for communication and conflict management. This period marks a turning point in the modern history of China-India border diplomacy and sets the stage for understanding later standoffs and military incidents.
Dear listeners, after exploring the confidence-building agreements of the 1990s, we now turn to one of the most high-profile border incidents in recent decades, the Doklam Standoff of 2017. This confrontation involved India, China, and indirectly Bhutan, and it brought global attention to the strategic importance of the Himalayan border regions. Doklam, a plateau located near the tri-junction of India, China, and Bhutan, became a flashpoint because of its military and geopolitical significance, illustrating how unresolved historical disputes can re-emerge even decades after agreements.
That's correct, Adam. The Doklam Plateau is strategically important for several reasons. For China, control over the area allows access to vital transportation routes in the Tibet Autonomous Region. For India, Doklam is critical because of its proximity to the Siliguri Corridor, also known as the Chicken's Neck, which is a narrow stretch of land connecting India's northeastern states with the rest of the country. Bhutan, which administers Doklam, has historically relied on India for security guidance, further complicating the dynamics of the standoff.
The standoff began in June 2017 when China initiated road construction in Doklam, intending to improve military access and infrastructure in the region. India, citing its security concerns and treaty obligations to Bhutan, dispatched troops to halt construction. Both sides quickly mobilized forces in challenging high-altitude terrain, creating a tense face-off that lasted for more than 2 months. The standoff highlighted the risks of infrastructure development in disputed areas and the speed at which historical tensions can escalate.
One of the striking aspects of the Doklam standoff was the involvement of multiple stakeholders. Bhutan, as the host nation of the plateau, expressed concerns over Chinese activities but relied on India's military and diplomatic support. China viewed India's intervention as a violation of its territorial claims and asserted its right to continue construction. This triangular dynamic complicated negotiations, requiring careful diplomacy to avoid miscalculations that could escalate into armed conflict.
During the standoff, both India and China deployed significant military assets, including infantry, artillery, and surveillance equipment, while avoiding full-scale engagement. The soldiers endured harsh weather, limited oxygen at high altitudes, and logistical challenges in transporting supplies. Despite the tension, neither side initiated large-scale hostilities, reflecting a careful balance between demonstrating resolve and avoiding escalation into war, which would have had severe regional and global consequences.
Diplomatically, the standoff triggered intense negotiations at multiple levels. Military commanders engaged in direct talks, while political representatives from India and China communicated frequently to de-escalate the situation. Bhutan acted as a mediator in the background, emphasizing the need to maintain peace and preserve sovereignty. After more than 2 months of tense standoff, both sides agreed to disengage and withdraw troops, restoring a fragile calm to the area.
The Doklam standoff had broader geopolitical implications. It highlighted the increasing strategic assertiveness of China in border areas and underscored India's commitment to defending its perceived security interests. Additionally, it demonstrated the importance of infrastructure development in disputed regions, as road construction and military logistics played a central role in the escalation. Observers worldwide recognized that even minor activities in sensitive areas could trigger major diplomatic crises.
Economically and politically, the standoff was a reminder of the interconnected nature of security and development. Both nations were aware that escalation could impact trade, investment, and international perception. While China continued to expand infrastructure in Tibet, India focused on strengthening its border defenses and improving road and rail networks in northern states. The Doklam incident reinforced the lesson that border management requires not only diplomacy, but also careful strategic planning and logistical preparation.
For India, Doklam reaffirmed the importance of trilateral relationships, particularly with Bhutan. India's support for Bhutan during the standoff strengthened bilateral ties and ensured that regional security concerns were addressed collectively. China, meanwhile, faced criticism for aggressive actions in a disputed area, emphasizing the delicate balance required in asserting territorial claims without provoking international scrutiny or regional pushback.
Militarily, the Doklam standoff also prompted modernization and strategic reassessment on both sides. India accelerated deployment of high-altitude units, improved surveillance capabilities, and enhanced communication networks to reduce response time in sensitive areas. China, meanwhile, continued infrastructure expansion in Tibet and reinforced troop presence near disputed areas, signaling that it would maintain vigilance over regions of strategic interest while managing public perception at home.
The standoff is also an important case study for international observers because it illustrates how complex the India-China border dispute remains. Even with agreements in place from the 1990s, historical grievances, territorial claims, and strategic calculations can quickly lead to confrontation. Doklam shows that diplomacy alone cannot fully resolve disputes without continuous attention to military preparedness, local conditions, and regional alliances.
Another key takeaway for listeners is that Doklam emphasized the importance of patience, negotiation, and restraint. Both India and China avoided open warfare despite weeks of tension, highlighting the value of structured dialogue and confidence-building mechanisms. The incident reinforced lessons from previous conflicts, such as the 1962 war and later standoffs, that escalation can be prevented when communication channels are active and when both sides recognize the costs of conflict.
In conclusion, the Doklam standoff was a vivid reminder that historical border disputes between India and China are not merely relics of the past. They have practical modern implications for regional security, diplomacy, and development. The incident demonstrated the continuing relevance of military readiness, strategic infrastructure, and careful diplomacy, as well as the importance of alliances and cooperative engagement in managing sensitive border areas.
For our listeners, understanding Doklam provides insight into how India and China navigate high-stakes disputes in remote regions. It shows that even with agreements and past lessons, unresolved historical claims can quickly resurface, requiring careful coordination, negotiation, and a constant balance between demonstrating strength and pursuing peace. The standoff is a modern example of the ongoing complexity of the China-India border dispute.
Dear listeners, as we continue exploring the modern history of the China-India border, we arrive at the Galwan Valley clash of 2020, one of the most serious confrontations between the two nations in decades. This incident marked the first deadly conflict along the line of actual control in over 45 years and shocked the international community. It demonstrated that despite decades of agreements and confidence-building measures, the border dispute remains highly volatile and strategically sensitive.
That's right, Adam. The Galwan Valley, located in the disputed region of eastern Ladakh, is a high-altitude, rugged area with glaciers, rivers, and steep cliffs. Its geographical importance lies in its proximity to strategic supply routes and its position near the Chinese-held Aksai-Chin region. Both India and China have long viewed control over this region as vital for strategic and defensive reasons, making any military presence here a sensitive matter.
The clash occurred in June 2020, when tensions escalated following weeks of face-offs and mutual troop buildups along several points of the LAC. Reports indicate that both sides engaged in aggressive patrolling and attempted to assert dominance in key patrol points. The confrontation quickly turned violent in the Galwan Valley, with soldiers from both sides using melee weapons and hand-to-hand combat rather than firearms, due to prior agreements prohibiting the use of guns along the LAC.
Tragically, the clash resulted in the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and an undisclosed number of Chinese troops, highlighting the extreme risks of border confrontations in such high-altitude terrain. The loss of life shocked both nations and drew intense domestic attention, with public sentiment demanding strong responses. The incident also underscored the human cost of unresolved territorial disputes, particularly in regions with challenging environmental conditions and harsh climates.
The Galwan Valley clash was preceded by months of incremental troop movements and infrastructure development by both sides. China had constructed roads, bunkers, and other facilities in the region, while India accelerated its own border infrastructure projects, including bridges, roads, and airstrips. These developments, although framed as defensive, were perceived by the opposite side as provocative, creating a cycle of suspicion and escalation that eventually culminated in direct confrontation.
Diplomatically, the clash triggered urgent communications between India and China, with both nations seeking to de-escalate tensions while maintaining their territorial claims. High-level military and political talks were convened, focusing on disengagement, restoration of patrol protocols, and preventing future violent incidents. The incident demonstrated that even decades of confidence-building measures could be undermined by small actions on the ground, particularly when both sides interpreted them as threats.
The Galwan clash had broader geopolitical consequences as well. It drew international attention to the India-China border, highlighting the strategic importance of the Himalayan region. Nations around the world monitored the situation closely, concerned about the potential for wider escalation and the implications for regional stability. For India and China, the clash served as a reminder that border disputes are not only national issues, but also have global security implications.
Following the clash, India and China engaged in multiple rounds of military and diplomatic talks aimed at restoring status quo and disengaging troops from frontline positions. These talks emphasized the need to respect agreements from previous decades, maintain calm along the LAC, and avoid provocations that could trigger further violence. Both countries eventually agreed to a phased disengagement in areas like Pangong Tso and Gogra, but the Galwan Valley itself remained a symbol of the fragility of peace along the border.
Militarily, the clash prompted both nations to reassess strategies for high-altitude deployment. India increased troop presence, constructed additional infrastructure, and enhanced surveillance along the entire northern frontier. China, meanwhile, reinforced its positions in Tibet and border areas near Ladakh. The focus on infrastructure, high-altitude readiness, and rapid troop mobility became critical for both sides, highlighting the continuing importance of logistics and preparation in preventing future conflicts.
The clash also influenced domestic politics and public perception in both countries. In India, it fueled nationalist sentiments and a call for stronger border defense, while in China, it was portrayed as a defense of territorial sovereignty and national pride. The incident showed that public opinion and domestic politics can intensify tensions and place additional pressure on governments to adopt firm stances, even while attempting to manage diplomacy quietly behind the scenes.
Economically and strategically, the Galwan clash also had implications for bilateral trade, regional alliances, and defense spending. India temporarily restricted certain Chinese investments and technology, while China emphasized the importance of securing its infrastructure and regional influence. The incident reinforced that border conflicts are not isolated events. They are deeply connected to national security, trade, diplomacy, and global perceptions of power.
For our listeners, the key takeaway from the Galwan Valley clash is that unresolved border disputes can escalate quickly, even with decades of protocols and agreements in place. Geography, history, infrastructure development, and strategic calculation all intersect in ways that make these regions highly sensitive. The clash is a reminder that constant vigilance, clear communication, and disciplined military conduct are essential to prevent small incidents from becoming full-scale confrontations.
In conclusion, the Galwan Valley incident of 2020 is a stark illustration of how the China-India border dispute remains one of the most complex and sensitive in the world. It shows that historical grievances, strategic ambitions, and modern infrastructure development can combine to create flashpoints. For policymakers, the lessons are clear. Diplomacy, infrastructure management, and military preparedness must work together to prevent escalation, protect lives, and maintain regional stability.
Understanding Galwan helps listeners see the real human and strategic costs of unresolved border disputes. While India and China continue negotiations and partial disengagement, the risk of future incidents remains. The clash emphasizes that ongoing dialogue, confidence-building measures, and careful military planning are not optional. They are critical to maintaining peace along one of the world's most contentious borders.
Dear listeners, as we reach the conclusion of today's discussion, it is important to reflect on the lessons learned from the China-India border dispute and its broader implications. From the 1962 war to the Doklam Standoff and the Galwan Valley clash, history shows that unresolved territorial disputes, high-altitude challenges, and strategic ambitions can combine to create periods of tension, risk, and uncertainty, requiring careful diplomacy and military preparedness.
That's right, Adam. One of the primary lessons is the importance of structured dialogue and confidence-building measures. Agreements from 1993 and 1996, as well as protocols after 2020, demonstrate that communication between military commanders, regular meetings, and clear protocols for patrols and infrastructure development can prevent minor incidents from escalating into major conflicts. These mechanisms have repeatedly proven essential in maintaining a fragile peace along the LAC.
Another key insight is the role of infrastructure and logistics in modern border management. Roads, bridges, airstrips, and surveillance systems are not merely defensive assets. They are strategic tools that influence mobility, deterrence, and the balance of power. Both India and China have invested heavily in such infrastructure, reflecting the critical importance of preparation and terrain adaptation in high-altitude regions, where environmental challenges significantly affect operational capabilities.
Military modernization and high-altitude readiness are also crucial lessons. The experiences of the 1962 war, Doklam and Galwan, highlight the need for specialized troops, rapid deployment capabilities, and effective supply chains. Both nations continue to refine their strategies and doctrines to respond to threats while minimizing the risk of escalation, emphasizing that tactical preparedness must go hand in hand with strategic diplomacy.
Diplomacy, however, remains at the heart of managing the dispute. High-level talks, regular Corps commander meetings, and multilateral engagement demonstrate that even in the face of historical grievances and ongoing friction, dialogue is indispensable. Negotiations help reduce misunderstandings, provide a framework for disengagement, and allow both sides to assert their positions without resorting to open conflict, showing that restraint and negotiation are critical tools for national security.
Public perception and domestic politics also play a significant role. Incidents like Galwan show that nationalist sentiment and political pressures can influence decision-making, making it essential for leaders to balance domestic expectations with pragmatic strategies. Maintaining credibility while avoiding escalation requires careful messaging, transparent communication, and a nuanced understanding of public opinion, alongside military and diplomatic measures.
Another important lesson is the regional and global impact of the dispute. The LAC is not an isolated frontier. It affects South Asian geopolitics, economic partnerships, and international perceptions. Neighboring countries, global powers, and economic actors closely monitor developments, recognizing that instability along the China-India border can ripple across trade, regional security, and strategic alliances. Border management, therefore, is a concern with far-reaching consequences.
The historical perspective is equally important. Past conflicts, such as the 1962 war, have shaped military doctrines, strategic thinking, and diplomatic practices. By studying these events, both nations understand the consequences of miscalculations and the importance of learning from previous mistakes. History also reinforces the idea that unresolved disputes require ongoing engagement, patience, and adaptation to evolving geopolitical realities.
Technology has also become a central factor in contemporary border management. Surveillance systems, satellite imagery, and real-time monitoring help both countries maintain situational awareness and reduce the likelihood of accidental escalation. The integration of technology into diplomacy and military strategy highlights how modern tools complement traditional measures, ensuring more informed decisions and more effective crisis management along the LAC.
For our listeners, it is clear that the China-India border dispute offers numerous lessons for global conflict management. Effective border diplomacy requires a combination of communication, infrastructure development, military readiness, technological integration, and strategic patience. conflicts can be prevented when both sides invest in these areas, demonstrating that preparation, negotiation, and restraint are more effective than confrontation.
In conclusion, the China-India border dispute illustrates the complex interplay of history, strategy, geography, and diplomacy. From wars and standoffs to confidence-building agreements and modern surveillance, the region teaches us that peace is not automatic, but must be actively maintained through careful planning and continuous engagement. Both nations continue to navigate this delicate balance, with lessons that are relevant not only for Asia, but for border management worldwide.
As we wrap up, dear listeners, it is important to remember that borders are more than lines on a map. They represent national interests, strategic calculations, and the lives of those who serve in these challenging regions. The history and ongoing dynamics of the China-India border remind us of the value of dialogue, preparedness, and thoughtful diplomacy in managing one of the most sensitive frontiers in the world.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us on this detailed journey through history, conflict, and diplomacy along the China-India border. We hope this podcast has provided clarity, insight, and a deeper understanding of why this region remains strategically critical. Your opinions and perspectives are important to us, so please share your thoughts in the comments about how you see the future of the LAC and the role of diplomacy in maintaining peace.
Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The English Globe, so you can stay updated on our in-depth discussions of global events. We also invite you to tell us where you are listening from and what other topics you would like us to explore. Thank you for being part of this conversation, and remember that understanding history and diplomacy is key to understanding today's world.